I didn't know my life was about to split cleanly in two over something so small, so quiet, so easily dismissed. A laugh, a sentence tossed into the air like it didn't matter, a gift held up like a joke. At that moment, standing just outside the living room with grocery bags cutting into my fingers, I realized that the person I loved didn't see me at all. She laughed with her friends and said, "Look what he got me. Does he think I'm broke?" And everyone laughed with her. I didn't storm in. I didn't shout. I didn't demand an explanation. I stood there frozen, my heart dropping into a hollow place I didn't know existed, listening as the woman I'd spent the last year and a half loving casually stripped my effort of its meaning. She talked about my gift like it was something random, cheap, embarrassing, like it said something unfortunate about her to the people she cared most about impressing. I drove home afterward with shaking hands, telling myself not to overreact, that it was just a joke, that couples misstep sometimes, that love isn't perfect. But there was a weight in my chest that wouldn't lift, a knowing I couldn't explain yet. Something had cracked, and I could feel it spreading. That night, alone in my kitchen, I opened a folder I hadn't planned to open. Inside was a piece of paper that told a truth she didn't know yet, a truth I had worked months to uncover, restore, and protect. A truth that tied a simple, overlooked object back to her childhood, to her grandmother, to a part of her story she once trusted me enough to share. I didn't confront her, I didn't accuse her, I didn't beg her to understand. Instead, I made a choice that would force the truth to speak for itself, quietly, clearly, without me having to raise my voice even once. The next morning, while she was doing her makeup, I left that truth where she would eventually find it. And then I walked away. By the time my phone started buzzing with messages, I already knew this wasn't just about a gift. It was about value, about respect, about who someone becomes when they think no one important is listening. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I was 32 when I met him, and at the time, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from life. Stability, honesty, a partner who didn't need grand gestures to feel secure, someone who understood that love often lives in the quiet choices people make when no one is watching. I worked in restoration, antiques, vintage items, things with history, things most people overlooked or dismissed as outdated. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't the kind of job that impressed people at parties, but I loved it. There was something deeply grounding about taking something broken or forgotten and giving it a second life. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue on a warm afternoon that felt easy in every way. He stood near the grill, laughing with a drink in his hand, confident without trying too hard. When we started talking, it felt natural, like the conversation picked up mid-sentence, even though we'd never met before. We talked about work, travel, the kinds of lives we imagined for ourselves. By the end of the night, we were sitting on the back steps, the noise of the party fading into the background, sharing stories like we were old friends. Things moved fast after that, not recklessly, but comfortably. He was ambitious, socially polished, and knew how to command a room. He had a circle of friends who adored him, a demanding job that required long hours, and a presence that drew attention wherever we went. He said he admired my work, that he found it charming, meaningful. He told people I had old soul hands, that I could make anything beautiful again if I tried hard enough. I believed him. About 3 months into our relationship, one night while we were curled up on his couch, he told me about his grandmother. She was the woman who had raised him after his parents divorced, the steady center of his childhood. He talked about her kitchen, about the way she'd hum while she cooked, about a small vintage music box she used to wind up so they could dance together on the linoleum floor. When she passed away 5 years earlier, the music box was lost during an estate sale before he could claim it. I remember how his voice softened when he talked about it, how his fingers traced idle circles on my arm. That story stayed with me. It felt intimate, like a quiet trust being placed in my hands. As our relationship grew, I started spending more time around his friends and family. His friends were loud, opinionated, and loved to tease. They cared deeply about appearances, about status, about who was doing better than whom. His family was polite but distant, their approval conditional and unspoken. I often felt like I was being measured against something invisible, but I told myself it was in my head. Love, I thought, meant learning to navigate different worlds. When his birthday came and went without much ceremony, he shrugged it off. Birthdays aren't a big deal, he said. But when mine approached, he talked openly about expectations, about what his friends usually did for each other, about experiences and gifts that made statements. I smiled and listened, quietly filing away what he valued and what he dismissed. I wasn't rich, but I did okay. I knew my limits, financially and emotionally. I believed effort mattered more than price tags, and when his birthday approached, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Finding that music box became my mission. I spent 4 months scouring estate sales, antique shops, and online auctions. I learned everything I could about the maker, the year, the hand-painted roses on the lid. When I finally found one that matched his description perfectly, I paid more than I should have, and then spent 2 weeks restoring it. The mechanism was broken, the paint chipped, the velvet interior worn thin. I fixed every part of it carefully, lovingly. When I gave it to him at dinner, just the two of us at his favorite restaurant, he opened the box, stared at it for a moment, smiled politely, and said, "Oh, that's sweet. Thank you." No recognition, no emotion, just that. I told myself not to read into it, but something inside me had already started to shift. After that dinner, I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to convince myself I was imagining the disconnect. People react to surprises differently, I told myself. Not everyone shows emotion the same way. Still, there was a subtle change in the way he spoke about the gift afterward. He never mentioned it again. It didn't appear on his shelf or dresser. The box seemed to vanish into the background of his apartment, as if it were just another object taking up space rather than something tied to a memory he once described with so much warmth. In the days that followed, small things began to stand out more sharply. He spent more time on his phone when we were together, scrolling through messages from friends, reacting to group chats I wasn't part of. When I asked about his plans, he answered vaguely, already halfway somewhere else in his mind. There was a new edge to his tone when he talked about money, about what his friends were buying, where they were going, how their lives were leveling up. I listened quietly, feeling myself slowly pushed into the role of observer instead of partner. One evening, we attended a birthday gathering for one of his friends. The room was full of laughter, designer clothes, expensive drinks. I stood beside him, smiling politely, while conversations swirled around promotions, vacations, and purchases meant to be seen. When someone asked what I did, I answered honestly: restoration, antiques, vintage furniture. A few nods followed, polite but distant, before the conversation drifted elsewhere. He didn't jump in. He didn't add context or pride to my words. He just let the silence sit. On the drive home, he joked lightly about how different our worlds were, how his friends didn't really get my line of work. I laughed along, but something tightened in my chest. It wasn't that I needed his friends' approval. It was the realization that he wasn't defending me in spaces where it mattered to him. I started noticing how often he adjusted himself depending on who was around. With me, he was softer, more reflective. With his friends, sharper, louder, more dismissive. I wondered which version was real, and which one I was meant to adapt to. When I brought it up gently one night, he waved it off. "You're overthinking," he said. "It's not that deep." But it was deep to me. A few days later, he mentioned having friends over, a casual get-together. I offered to help, asked if he needed anything. He smiled and said he had it covered, but asked if I could grab some groceries on my way over the next evening. It felt normal, domestic, like we were still building something together. I didn't know that walking into his apartment that night would change the way I saw him forever. I didn't know that the laughter I was about to hear would strip away every excuse I'd been making for him, or that the gift I poured months of care into would become a punchline the moment he thought I wasn't listening. Looking back, the signs were all there. I just wasn't ready to accept what they were pointing to yet. I arrived at his place that evening, carrying 2 heavy grocery bags, the plastic handles digging into my palms. I remember thinking, absurdly, about how normal it all felt. This was the kind of thing couples did. You ran errands for each other. You showed up when asked. You assumed you were welcome. The door was unlocked. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard laughter spilling from the living room, loud and carefree. His voice blended easily with the others, relaxed in a way it hadn't been with me lately. I took off my shoes quietly and walked down the short hallway, already smiling to myself, ready to join them. That smile died before I reached the corner. I stopped just out of sight. the grocery bag still in my hands, when I heard him say something that made my stomach drop. He was holding the music box, lifting it up as if it were a prop, not a memory, not something restored by hand, not something chosen with care. "Look what she got me," he said, laughing. "Does she think I'm broke or something?" The room erupted. His friends laughed easily, comfortably, like this was exactly the kind of joke they'd been waiting for. One of them asked what it even was supposed to be used for. Another said it looked like something you'd find shoved in the back of a thrift store. Someone else added that effort didn't matter if the taste was bad, that jewelry or cash would have made way more sense. He shrugged along with them, adding his own comments, feeding the moment instead of stopping it. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. He hadn't seen me yet. None of them had. I watched from the doorway as he laughed at something I'd spent months searching for, restoring, thinking about. Something tied to a story he once told me with softness in his voice and tears he didn't quite let fall. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad reaction at dinner. This was who he was when he thought I wasn't listening. I cleared my throat. The laughter stopped abruptly. He turned around, his face draining of color for half a second before he forced a smile. "Oh, hey, I didn't hear you come in." I walked past him without answering and set the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter. My movements felt strangely calm, disconnected from the way my hands were trembling. He tried to explain it away immediately. Said they were just talking about gifts. Said it was all jokes. Said I knew how his friends were. I looked at him, then at the people sitting on his couch, and realized something important. None of them looked embarrassed. Not really. They looked caught, not sorry. "I'm going to head out," I said. He asked me to stay. I didn't. I left before he could say anything else, before my voice could crack, before I did something that would make him feel like the victim. The drive home felt endless. I wasn't angry yet. I was empty, like something essential had been scooped out of me, leaving behind a quiet, echoing space. When I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went straight to my filing cabinet, to the place where I kept records of every restoration I'd ever done. And that's when I found the receipt, the date, the amount, the provenance documentation, the name that made my chest tighten. His grandmother's name. That was the moment I understood exactly what that music box was and exactly how little he had cared to know. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, the receipt spread out in front of me like evidence in a trial I never asked to be part of. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I stared at his grandmother's name printed neatly on the page, the provenance trail, confirming what I had suspected but never dared to say out loud. It wasn't just similar. It wasn't close. It was the music box, the one from his childhood, the one he had danced to in that kitchen he described so vividly. My hands didn't shake then. My chest didn't tighten. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that only comes when something painful finally makes sense. I thought back to the dinner, to the polite smile, to the dismissive, "That's sweet." I thought about the way he hadn't asked a single question, hadn't leaned in, hadn't cared enough to look closely. I realized I had been giving him the benefit of the doubt while he had been giving me none at all. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the laughter, the way his friends had joined in so easily, the way he hadn't stopped them. I asked myself what I had missed, how long this version of him had existed without me noticing. Was it recent, shaped by his environment, or had it always been there, waiting for a moment like this to surface? By morning, I knew what I needed to do, not to punish him, not to humiliate him, but to let the truth speak without me having to explain it, justify it, or defend my feelings. I didn't want an argument fueled by emotion. I wanted clarity. I drove to his place early, before work, while the city was still waking up. He was getting ready in the bathroom when I arrived, standing in front of the mirror, applying makeup with practiced ease. He smiled when he saw me, relief flickering across his face. "I'm glad you came by," he said, "about last night." "It's fine," I replied evenly. "I just wanted to drop something off." I walked into the bedroom, folded the receipt and the documentation carefully, and placed them under his makeup kit on the counter. Right where he'd see them eventually, but not immediately. I didn't explain. I didn't elaborate. I kissed his cheek, told him to have a good day at work, and left before he could ask what I meant. At my workshop later that morning, I tried to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of restoration. A Victorian chair sat half-finished in front of me, fabric pulled back, wood exposed. Normally, this was the part I loved most. The quiet focus, the sense of progress, but my mind kept drifting. Around 10, my phone started buzzing. Where did you get this? Is this real? Why didn't you tell me? Please call me. I didn't respond. I kept working, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Around noon, I heard the door chime at the workshop. I looked up to see him standing there, the papers clutched in his hand, eyes red, breathing uneven. The noise of the old radiator filled the space between us. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice cracking. Tell you what, I said calmly. That it was hers. That it was my grandmother's actual music box. I set my tools down slowly and met his gaze. I did tell you, when I gave it to you. You just didn't listen. That was when the silence finally broke. He stepped further into the workshop, clutching the papers like they might disappear if he loosened his grip. The space smelled like wood stain and old fabric, familiar and grounding to me, but he looked out of place standing there, surrounded by half-finished projects and tools that told the story of a life he had never fully respected. I was distracted, he said quickly, at dinner. I had a stressful day at work. I didn't process it. I swear, I didn't realize what it was. I studied his face, searching for something steady to hold on to. And your friends? I asked. Were you distracted when you told them I had bad taste? When you laughed about me shopping at thrift stores? His face flushed. You heard that? Every word. He tried to explain it away, saying they were all joking, that the conversation had gotten out of hand, that he just went along with it. The more he talked, the more I realized how instinctive it had been for him to protect his image instead of me, how easily he slipped into agreement when it earned him laughter. This, he said, holding up the papers, his voice breaking, this is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me. I just didn't understand it at the time. That's the problem, I replied quietly. You didn't care enough to understand. The radiator ticked loudly in the corner as silence stretched between us. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back. The distance felt necessary, protective. I wasn't ready to be touched by someone who had made me feel small for caring. I told him I needed time, not a day, not a promise. Time to decide whether I could unhear what I'd heard, unsee what I'd seen. He asked how much. I told him I didn't know, and I meant it. Over the next few days, the situation grew heavier. His messages started long and apologetic, paragraphs filled with regret, self-reflection, and promises to do better. He sent flowers to my workshop, left voicemails where his voice cracked as he talked about winding up the music box, about thinking of his grandmother, about realizing what he'd almost thrown away. Friends reached out too, mutual friends, his friends. Some gently suggested I was being too sensitive, that everyone joked like that sometimes. Others urged me to forgive him because he was trying. His family became involved, his mother calling to remind me how stressed he'd been lately, how much pressure he was under, how relationships required grace. Each conversation chipped away at something inside me, not because they were convincing, but because they all seemed to center his discomfort, his regret, his image. No one asked how it felt to stand in a doorway and hear someone you loved laugh at you. No one asked how it felt to realize your effort had been embarrassing to the person it was meant for. I felt myself changing during that week. Quieter, more observant, less willing to smooth things over for the sake of peace. I stopped rushing to respond, stopped explaining myself. I started paying attention to how often I had done the emotional labor for both of us. By the time I agreed to meet him for coffee, I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. I was looking for honesty, and I wasn't sure he was ready to give me the kind I needed. The night before we met for coffee, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every version of us I could remember, trying to locate the exact moment where things had gone wrong. Not the obvious one, not the laughter, not the joke, the earlier, quieter shifts. The times I had swallowed discomfort because it seemed easier than naming it. The times I had translated his indifference into stress, his dismissal into humor, his silence into misunderstanding. I realized how often I had been shrinking to keep the peace. That realization hurt more than the breakup itself. When I arrived at the cafe the next morning, he was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him. He'd ordered my usual, black coffee, no sugar. That small familiarity almost broke me. I sat down and wrapped my hands around the mug, even though the coffee was already lukewarm. He started talking immediately, about how ashamed he felt, about how the week apart had forced him to confront parts of himself he didn't like, about how he'd been measuring his worth, and by extension mine, through other people's approval. His voice trembled, his eyes filled with tears. He said he hated who he'd become. I listened without interrupting, waiting for something to land. "I know I hurt you," he said, "and I know saying sorry doesn't fix it, but I want to be better. I want to choose you." I took a slow breath. "I spent 4 months looking for that music box," I said. 2 weeks restoring it. I researched the maker, tracked the sale records, verified the provenance. I did all of that because I loved you and I wanted to give you something that mattered." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "I know. And you couldn't even pretend to care for 5 minutes," I continued, "before you started making fun of it to your friends." "I hate myself for that," he said. "I really do." "I don't want you to hate yourself," I replied quietly. "I want you to understand why this hurts so much." He said he did. He promised he did. But as I listened, something inside me stayed heavy, because understanding, I realized, wasn't the same as change, and guilt wasn't the same as respect. I leaned back in my chair and said the thing I'd been circling all week. "I can forgive you for not recognizing the music box. I can even forgive you for the way you reacted at dinner. But I can't forget how you talked about it when you thought I wasn't listening. That wasn't a mistake. That was honesty." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. His silence said more than his words ever could. That was the lowest point, sitting across from someone I still loved, realizing love wasn't enough, realizing that no amount of effort could restore something that had cracked at its foundation. I felt exhausted, not angry, not dramatic, just deeply bone-tired. For the first time since this all began, I stopped wondering what I could do to fix us. And that was when I knew something was about to change. I sat there for a long moment after his silence settled between us, listening to the hum of the espresso machine behind the counter, the soft clatter of cups, the murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with us. The world kept moving, indifferent to the quiet ending happening at our table. And in that stillness, something inside me finally clicked into place. This wasn't about the music box anymore. It never really was. It was about what he saw when he looked at me and who he became when other people were watching. He asked me, almost in a whisper, "So what does this mean for us?" I looked at him and saw him clearly for the first time. Not the version from the barbecue who felt easy and warm, not the man who spoke softly about his grandmother in the glow of the television, but the man who cared deeply about how he was perceived, who adapted himself to fit the expectations of the loudest people in the room, even when it meant diminishing the person who loved him most. "I think we need to be honest about what this is," I said carefully. "You want someone who fits into your life in a very specific way, someone impressive, someone who makes you look good to your friends. And that's not wrong. It's just not me." He shook his head, tears sliding down his face. "That's not true. I love you." "I believe that," I said. "But love isn't the same as value, and right now, you only value what you're afraid of losing." I stood up then, the decision settling in my chest with a surprising sense of calm. I restore old furniture. I hunt down vintage pieces most people don't understand. I care about stories and history and effort, and I need to be with someone who doesn't see that as something to apologize for. He tried to reach for my hand, tried to tell me he could change, that he would change. I didn't doubt that he wanted to. But wanting to change under pressure wasn't the same as choosing to change when it mattered. "I think we're done," I said softly. He didn't argue. He didn't chase me. He just sat there, broken open by a truth he couldn't deny anymore. I walked out into the cold air feeling lighter than I had in weeks, even though my heart ached. Sometimes clarity hurts, but it also frees you. That afternoon, I made another decision. One that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with honoring the story tied to that music box. I didn't want it sitting in his apartment, unwanted again. It deserved better, and so did I. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet at first, then heavier as the days passed. For the first few mornings after we ended things, I woke up instinctively reaching for my phone, half expecting a message that could undo what I'd said. But none came. And strangely, that silence felt honest. He tried at first. Long texts filled with apologies and reflections, messages about therapy articles he'd read, about how he was rethinking his priorities, about how losing me had changed everything. Flowers arrived at my workshop, bright and out of place among wood shavings and half-restored chairs. A voicemail came late one night, his voice breaking, as he said he wound the music box and thought of his grandmother, thought of me, thought of what he'd thrown away. I listened once. I didn't respond. Friends started reaching out next. Some were careful, telling me they hoped I was okay. Others framed it differently, asking if we were just taking a break, suggesting I might be overreacting, reminding me that people make mistakes. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I had learned that not every truth needs to be explained to be valid. What mattered to me was the music box. It was still at his apartment. I didn't want it there, not because I wanted it for myself, but because it deserved to be with someone who understood what it was, who didn't see it as leverage or a bargaining chip. I texted him once, simply, "I'd like to pick up the music box. Let me know when you're free." He replied within minutes, "You can have it. I'll leave it with the building manager. I can't look at it anymore." That hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted him back, but because it confirmed what I already knew. He only valued the box when he thought it might fix us. Once it couldn't, it became a reminder he didn't want to face. The building manager handed it to me the next day, wrapped carelessly in newspaper, tucked inside a plain cardboard box. No note, no acknowledgement. I took it home and unwrapped it slowly, checking for damage. It was intact. I wound the mechanism and let the delicate melody fill my living room, watching the tiny ballerina spin. It felt like closure without words. That night, I did something I should have done earlier. I searched for his grandmother's name in obituary records and followed the trail to surviving family members. It took a few days and several phone calls, but eventually I reached a cousin. When I explained where the music box came from, she went quiet on the line. "We've been looking for that for years," she said softly. "After the estate sale, we thought it was gone forever." I told her the story, leaving out only what didn't matter anymore. When I offered to send it to her, she cried. So did I, after we hung up. A week after I mailed it, a thank you card arrived with a photo tucked inside. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6, winding the music box with a huge smile on her face. That made everything feel right again. Meanwhile, the consequences settled around him in ways I didn't need to witness closely to understand. Friends pulled back. His family stopped calling me with explanations. I heard through mutual contacts that his version of the story shifted depending on who was listening. Sometimes I was too sensitive. Sometimes he'd messed up, but meant well. I let the truth stand on its own. I didn't need revenge. Reality was doing enough on its own. It's been 3 months since the breakup, and I can say this honestly now. I'm okay. Better than okay. The kind of okay that doesn't come from distraction or denial, but from alignment. From living a life that no longer requires me to explain myself to be understood. I threw myself back into my work, not to avoid the pain, but to remember who I was before I started shrinking for someone else's comfort. I took on restoration projects that challenged me, pieces most people would have written off as unsalvageable. I started teaching a weekend workshop at the community college, showing people how to repair old furniture, how to see beauty in wear and age instead of flaws. Watching students light up when something finally came back to life under their hands reminded me why I loved this work in the first place. I ran into him once, about a month after everything ended. It was at a grocery store, of all places. He was with someone new, a man in an expensive suit, leaning against a car that probably cost more than I make in a year. He saw me and looked away, pretending he hadn't. I didn't chase the moment. I didn't need closure from him anymore. A mutual friend later told me he'd been telling people I was too sensitive, that I'd overreacted to a joke. Maybe I did. Or maybe I simply refused to laugh along when someone revealed how little they valued me. I've learned that people often minimize the harm they caused when facing it would require real accountability. The thing about restoration work is that it teaches you something important very quickly. Some breaks are clean. You can glue them, clamp them, and they're good as new. Other breaks run through the core of the piece. No matter how much effort you put in, no matter how skilled your hands are, they can't be made whole again. Our relationship was the second kind. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter. I'm grateful. Grateful I saw the truth before I built a future on it. Grateful the music box ended up where it belonged, in the hands of a child who would grow up associating it with love instead of embarrassment. Grateful I listened to that quiet moment inside me that said, "This matters," even when everyone else tried to convince me it didn't. Sometimes things fall apart not to punish us, but to protect us. Sometimes the thing that hurts the most is the thing that saves you the most time. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from something that no longer honors who you are.